Hello, everyone, and welcome to another awesome negative space panel. I will keep my announcements short since last time I embarrassed myself stumbling over every single word I was trying to get out there. Only thing I have this week is we are about 8 days away from our regular deadline for our women's comic book writing competition. That one, our regular deadline is February 9th. So anyone that's looking to submit to that one has until then, and then prices go up, and we have about a month left before our final deadline. We just announced our mentors for that one, which we're very excited to have Heather Antos back. We have editor Sarah Litt, and actually they're all editors. Our third editor is Brittany Matter, who is also a writer as well. So if you're looking to submit to that one, go check it out on our website. That's all I have. So I will introduce Josh Sippie, who will host us for this amazing panel. Thank you, and take it away.
Thank you, Noel. As he said, welcome to everyone that's here. Thank you for being here again. So today we're going to be, before I start, actually, we are, make sure that if you have questions, you get those in the Q&A. So on the Zoom dashboard, there's a Q&A button down there. If you have questions during the course of the conversation, be sure to ask them and I will get to them as soon as I can. All right, so today we're talking about the balance of being a writer and an editor, among many other things. And joining me, naturally, is a writer and editor himself. So Brendan Deneen is the author of the award-winning coming-of-age novel Ninth Circle, the 4-volume Night Night Groot picture book series for Marvel, the middle-grade graphic novel Green Arrow Stranded for DC Comics, and the horror novel Morbius Blood Ties for Marvel Titan. His next novel, Guardians of the Galaxy Annihilation, comes out in April 2023 from Marvel Titan, and his post-apocalyptic romance thriller novel Tracer comes out in 2025 from Blackstone Publishing. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be here. So the first place we always want to start, there's a lot we want to dig into today, but I always like to sort of hear if you have a creative origin story, sort of that moment in your life where you were like, storytelling, that's what I got to do. Was there a moment for you where that sort of hit you?
I mean, the short answer is I feel like it's always been there. And first off, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And thanks to anybody who's watching. But yeah, man, so I grew up in the late 70s and 80s, and I'm the youngest of 4 kids. And so my oldest brother had about 200 comic books, mostly Marvel, when I was growing up. And I think it was just a very casual hobby for him. But for me, he's 8 years older than I am. I read those comics, and we're talking like it was like Fantastic Four number 200, Amazing Spider-Man number 200. Around the era, like the late 70s comics. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. I was like, this is the greatest thing and I was young. This is the greatest thing I've ever seen. And that's where I cut my teeth in terms of reading. That's the very first comics I read were those late 70s classics. So by the time I was 8 years old, I was writing and drawing my own comic book series called Marvel Man, which I could definitely get sued for. But I actually wrote and drew 20 issues of this comic, Marvel Man. I mean, each panel was 1 page, so it was like a 20-page comic, but really it was 20 panels. Just the panels were gigantic. And the art, I'm basically the worst artist who's ever lived. My stick figures aren't not great. But even then, the stories were kind of cool. I've reread them, like not obviously as an 8-year-old, they weren't amazing, but like not bad. They were pretty interesting stories. And that's honestly where I knew like this is what I want to do. So I was actually 8 years old, and I was like, this is it. This is what I want to do. I want to tell stories for a living. And then I had to figure out how to actually do that, which again in the 80s pre-internet proved to be very challenging.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like comics was your original lane. I asked because, there's this thing of writers should choose a lane and stay in it, but you've done so many different lanes. So when did you start branching off into other methods of storytelling?
Yeah, so I did comics primarily. And then probably, well, it's interesting. When I was in 5th grade, I actually don't think I've ever told this story publicly. When I was in 5th grade, we had our teacher gave us words, like vocabulary words, and said to write each week. And they said write a sentence with each one of these words. And every other kid, and I'm sure most kids ever, just wrote one sentence with a word. What I did is I took each word and I made it into a short story. And each week the story continued, and it was about a kid. Remember, this is the early 80s. It was about a kid who was being sucked into video games. So one week it would be Pac-Man, the next week it would be invaders, etc. Space Invaders. And so each week, and the teacher, who I think was only an aide, not only an aide, was an aide, was just like blown away. And she was like, she pulled me aside. She's like, "This is amazing." And so I started writing short stories a little bit after that. And then when I was a sophomore in high school, that's when I really started writing short stories. I felt more seriously. And this is actually kind of a fun anecdote that I've told before. But when I was in 10th grade, I was reading Grendel by Matt Wagner. I was really into Matt Wagner at the time, into all comics. But I loved Mage, and I really liked Grendel. And at the end of Grendel number 12, for those who remember, was the end of the Christine Spar storyline, who's the granddaughter of the original Grendel. There's a lot of inside baseball. I apologize. And Matt Wagner like invited people to pitch where we thought the Grendel storyline could go. So again, I was 15, I think, or 16. And so I sent a copy of a short story I had written and a pitch about where I thought the Grendel storyline should go. Again, this is before email. So I mailed this letter in and waited, and weeks, I assume, went by. And then one day I went to the mailbox, and there was a letter from Matt Wagner for me in my mailbox, and I freaked out and I read it. And he passed on my concept for Grendel, but he said, "Your story is really good for your age, and you should keep writing." And for me, that, even more than when I was 8, that was the moment where I was like, "Okay, I can do this." And I mean, I'll fast forward a little bit. In 2018 at New York Comic Con, I was able to meet Matt Wagner and spend some time with him. And but that's a fast forward. So that was the moment where I was like, I can do this. So at that point, I started writing fiction more and more, and comics, and I started sending, ideas to Marvel and DC. I would get rejection letters from them. The Marvel rejection letters had this great Marvel graphic on the back. Actually, DC had the great graphic, and then Marvel had Spider-Man. But I got rejection letters over and over again, but I kept trying, writing letters. And then when I was 18, I don't know why, I wrote my first novel, which for an 18-year-old is 235 pages, double-spaced manuscript. And it was terrible, like a terrible book that never sold. But I did it. I wrote a novel when I was 18. So at that point, I was like, I'm just going to write comics. I'm going to write novels, and we'll see what happens. And the rejection letters just stacked up. And in college, I actually wallpapered my bathroom with rejection letters.
I love hearing stories about people do with rejection letters, because there's always creative ways to paper your house with them. I heard somebody who covered their whole coffee table with them, so every time they set something down, they would see it.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. It's so interesting to me that even at such a young age, you were already pitching ideas. When did it sort of, were you self-educated? Was this something where you just sort of went on to before the internet, I assume? Did you just mail them stuff and think, let's see what happens? Was there somebody out there encouraging you to do this, or what was sort of the impetus there?
No, there's no encouragement. I was just like, I wanted to do it. And back then, it was the 80s. You go to the library, and they had these big books, like huge encyclopedia type books, and you couldn't even take them out of the library. I think they were so expensive. You could only use them there. And so it would be, here are all the addresses for all the agents and all, I can't remember what it's called. I spent so many hours with those books, but like the guide to the publishing world or something. And so I would photocopy, and it cost 10 cents per photocopy. And, I had a paper route, so I had some cash. I would photocopy, and then I would just, I don't know if they also gave an example how to write a query letter. I don't think so. And I would just mail it in. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. I think that was actually a benefit. Like, it's almost like too much information now, where it's like all these rules. And I was just like, I'm gonna do the best I can. And when I was 19, I actually got a letter back from a guy named Michael Urey at DC Comics. I had pitched a Timberwolf idea from Legion of Superheroes. And I got this letter. I was in college. I was a freshman in college. And I got a letter back from Michael Urey, who I'm now friends with all these years later. And he was like, this is really weird, but you pitched us the exact same idea that we are currently working on for Timberwolf, like literally the same exact concept. And so we can't use your idea, but I now invite you to pitch whatever you want to me personally. And so he and I began this letter writing relationship, and I got close with an original idea that ultimately it didn't happen. But that was another moment where I was like, maybe I can actually do this. But it was just another rejection letter for the wall ultimately.
A bigger one though, one that you could look at.
But a good one, like an almost.
So no, that's interesting. And one thing we often talk about on here is sort of breaking into the industry. Was there a moment for you where you felt like you broke in? Like, was there a project like a pitch that got accepted, or a project you were working on and you're like, I'm doing it now?
I mean, it took a long time. So that was, that letter from Michael Urey was 1991. And my first comic was not published until 2006. And I was writing and submitting ideas, all that time. So it took literally decades of rejection. One of the things I always advise people on is not to get stuck on one idea, because I know people, people pitch me stuff all the time, and I often hear that, I've been working on this forever. And I've been pitching this for 10 years. And I'm like, okay, I get it. What else have you written while you've been like, and they're like, oh, nothing. I'm just focused on pitching. Like, while you're pitching or submitting, it's like, you got to be writing too. Like that's one of my biggest pieces of advice, is never to get caught up. You got to be more than a one idea person. And that's been key for me. I wrote 3 novels before the 4th one is the one that sold. And that 4th one took me 15 years to write, which was crazy. But to answer your question, it wasn't until 2006 or more 2005 that I finally sold my first idea. So I even then I didn't really feel like I'd made it. It was a small publisher out of the UK called Marcosia that published my first comic. And ironically, I pitched in the 90s. I pitched that same comic to Karen Berger at Vertigo, and she never wrote back. And so when it came out in 2006, and I was working for Bob and Harvey Weinstein at the time, which is a whole other story. I sent Karen Berger a copy of the original pitch letter I sent her in the 90s, and a copy of the published #1, as not in a jerk way, like, hey, it's so funny, and she still never responded. So maybe if Karen Berger sees this someday, hey, thanks regardless.
So while you were pitching all of this, that was when you were working on your novels on the side. What else were you doing at this time to sort of prepare yourself for hopefully getting out there one day? Were you like still reading those books about agents and stuff? Like, were you looking for representation? What was your sort of mind process there?
Yeah, I mean, look, I was lucky or smart or dumb luck. I moved to New York when I was 25 years old. And that was when I was in the middle of writing that 4th novel that took me 15 years to write. So I moved to New York, and I took just a brainless job at a Swiss investment bank, which is not as glamorous as it sounds. So I did that for 3 years, and I was writing and directing and acting on the weekends and at night. And then after 3 years at the Swiss investment bank and doing a lot of independent artsy stuff, I quit my day job, and I was like, I'm never gonna work another day job. I'm just gonna be an artist and a writer and an actor. And so I was temping and to make money. And when you're temping, you can you can take a job one day or not, depending if I had an audition or whatever. And the temp agency called me and they said, would you be interested in an interview at a literary agency? And I didn't want a job, but I thought, well, maybe if I get this job, maybe I can get a literary agent out of this. So they didn't tell me the name of the company. They just gave me an address and a time in New York City. I was living in New York. And so I showed up, and it turned out to be the William Morris Agency, which is one of the largest agencies in the world. It's now William Morris Endeavor, or really WME. But this is back when it was still WMA. And so I interviewed for the job that I didn't particularly necessarily want, and I got hired as an assistant. Now at this point, I was 28 years old, so I was old for an assistant, older for an assistant. but I took the job and I was there for a year. And that's when I started to understand how agencies in Hollywood worked a little more, a little more in depth. After a year of that, I wasn't super happy. And so there was a brand new a website at the time called mediabistro.com, which now is an old website. But at the time it was, I mean, I think it had just launched and someone had said, "Oh, you should check it out." So I checked it out, and there was an ad from a movie company looking for somebody to work in the book to film department of this movie company. Again, no company name. And at the time, you couldn't email attachments out of William Morris because this was the early days of PDFs or whatever, and they were paranoid, I guess. And so you couldn't send attachments. So I couldn't even send my resume. I had to fax it. So I had to fax my resume to this company. I got called in, again, just an address. And it turned out to be Scott Rudin Productions. Scott Rudin is an infamous producer. You can just Google him. I won't even get into this. He's a complicated individual, very successful book to film producer, arguably one of the best ever. And so I was number 19 out of 20 people they interviewed. They handed me a 400-page manuscript, and they said, "Please write coverage of this by tomorrow morning." So I had to read overnight, had to read 400 pages and write an 8-page summary and then assessment, which I did, and I got the job. So then I was working for Scott Rudin for 2 years. So I was a book to film executive for Scott Rudin. I won't go into my whole career, but that's, you asked, how did I learn more about the agency world? I sort of went in through the back door. I learned, I didn't really mean to, actually, I didn't mean to at all. I had an opportunity, I went for it, and that was the beginning of what has now turned into basically a 25-year career as an inside man working for publishing companies and movie companies. So that's the long yet short answer to your question.
Perfect. And that's a good segue because I want to get into sort of how working in the industry has affected or influenced writing for that industry as well, because you're both a creator and a professional inside of the industry. Do they coexist pretty seamlessly?
It's not seamless, and you have to be really careful. So when I started working at William Morris when I was 28, that would have been the year 2000. I think I was talking to some other assistants, and I mentioned that I was a writer. And I don't remember who the person was, but they literally like pulled me aside. They're like, "Don't tell anyone that you're a writer. They will fire you immediately." And so they don't want to hear it when you start. They don't want to hear that you're an actor. They don't want to hear that you're a writer, that you're a sculptor. They want to hear that you are an assistant, and that you live and breathe like fetching coffee. And so I was very, very careful about that because I took that warning really seriously. And so I just stayed quiet about it for many, many years. And you sort of just start to realize when it's appropriate to talk about it. And there's no like golden moment where you're like, "Oh, ding, now it's okay to talk about this." You just figure out, okay, this is a safe person to mention it to. This is not a safe person to mention this to. So it's been amazing because I have been able to learn exactly how the industry works and how also not to be a jerk, honestly, and to watch people like Scott Rudin and Harvey Weinstein, who just are notoriously not nice. Obviously, Harvey for so many more reasons, and highly illegal ones. But just like I sort of learned, you can be good at your job, passionate about your art, and also not be a jerk. And that's one of the things that I've learned. I don't know if that was even part of your question, but yeah. So that's
Relevant
the answer, I guess.
nonetheless.
Yeah, it's an important part of it.
Right. So because you've done a lot of editorial work as well, both in traditional publishing and in comic book publishing, when did that side of you sort of take off? I imagine it's very tangential to your assistancy at an agency, right?
Yeah, so yeah, I guess that's right. Writing and editing can be very similar, and understanding why and how a story works. So yeah, as an assistant at William Morris, I was writing cover letters for my bosses that would go along with the manuscript that would go to the publishing companies. I was editing friends' scripts, as someone who was directing plays and acting in plays. They'd be like, "Hey, we should go produce this play," and I was studied English in college, so like, "Oh yeah, let me do a grammar path on this." So my grammar skills were strong, um, and then yeah, you just sort of, the more you're in that industry, the more of that kind of work you're doing. But I fell into editorial because I'm trying to think. So Scott Rudin, and then I worked for Bob and Harvey Weinstein, as I mentioned, for 4 years. That's a whole other Zoom probably. That's a whole conversation. But I was a development executive for those guys for 4 years, and then Harvey and I had a falling out, which is probably shocking to everyone who's listening to this. And I became a literary agent and book to film agent for 2 years. And I was doing that, and I love the job, but it's a very, very difficult way to make a living because it's commission based primarily, and it's just you want to be, generally speaking, young and maybe not have kids or not have a lot of financial burdens, because to start you have to wait for the money to come in, and again, it's commission based. So that was a tough way to make a living. So while I was an agent, there was a job opening at St. Martin's Press, specifically at Thomas Dunne Books, which is a division of, or was a division of St. Martin's Press, which is a division of Macmillan. And so I met with Tom Dunne. He had an editor position open, and I knew the editor in chief there. And Tom and I hit it off, and in the room, he offered me the job to be an editor at Thomas Dunne Books, a division of St. Martin's Press. I've never had anybody offer me a job in the room during an interview, but he is that kind of guy. So that's how I became an editor. Basically had a hell of an interview. I didn't have any official editorial experience, but they loved my connection to Hollywood. They liked my commercial sense, and that was in the year 2010, January 2010. So I guess 13 years ago, I became a professional editor, which I guess I didn't even realize it's almost exactly 13 years.
Do you feel like because I mean, editing and writing seem to fit together so well, but do you feel like being an editor helped you as a writer and vice versa?
Absolutely. Everyone says it, but to be a great writer, you need to read. And so my job as an editor is to read. And I think reading submissions, you start to see what works, and then you start to be aware of what sells, because you're following publishers marketplace. So you're seeing every deal. You're seeing books that you passed on that sell for a lot of money. You see books that you buy that you win at auction and that you were passionate about that do well. You see books that you buy that bomb, that you believed in, you edited, that somehow bomb, and you're like, how did this happen? So I think being an editor, you start to see trends. You start to, like, being in publishing is also about, and Hollywood is about kind of being a futurist. It's like, it's not what's hot now, what's going to be hot in a year. And so that's really hard. And so you can't just go by what's trending now. It's like, what is going to trend in a year, in 2 years? And that is very difficult. And then that starts to infuse your writing. And so as much as I love literary storytelling, my writing, as a result of being in the industry, has gotten more and more commercial. And I think that's why I've gotten more successful as a writer. And I read some of my old stuff and I'm like, oh man, some of it's overwritten, but sort of the pure literary aspirations there, I kind of miss it. It was so experimental, but now my writing's gotten much more commercial and maybe like just more straightforward. But being an editor, working in Hollywood, it teaches you how to write commercial, and I think that helps you be successful.
You covered this a little already, but I want to ask again, because it is something that I think writers often hear is, if you want to be a writer, don't be an editor. But it does feel like they fit together so well. And I know for people that are writers, being an editor makes sense. You're working in that industry that you want to be in. Any general advice for people that want to walk down both paths? You'd mentioned just not mentioning it to certain people, but anything else to sort of set yourself up for success if you want to do both?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say it again. You don't mention it right away. Again, you'll find the time. I mean, look, it's not a bad, if you like editing, if you're a good editor, it's a great job, and it really dovetails nicely with writing. Your job has to be the priority. You got to do your job first, and then you write. And sometimes I've seen editors who get burnt out from all of it, and they're like, I get home and I don't want to write. So that's something to be cautious of. I'm lucky, I guess, because I knock on wood, I've never had writer's block, and I have no problem like sitting down and writing. I've written 2 novels in the last couple of years in 2 months under contract, like 80,000 words in 2 months, which is insane. So if you have no problem sitting down and writing, no matter how tired you are or how many hours you've worked, then I would absolutely suggest getting a job in publishing. I don't think it's easy to get these jobs, I think generally you have to be in New York or in the city where the company exists. Obviously, COVID has changed that somewhat with remote working, but I think most places now are doing at least a couple days in the office. So sure, yeah, go get a job in publishing. It's easy to say. It's a competitive field. It doesn't pay incredibly well. It pays well, gotten better. I think there's been on Twitter, you see some outcry from people in publishing about amount of money and stuff like that. I don't really speak to that, but like it's a competitive industry. It doesn't pay a ton, but it's still competitive. And but if you can get a job in editorial and you think you can get home at night and still write, it is a great job to have, no question.
So that segues great into a Q&A question just came in. We have two of them. One of them I'm saving. One of them is relevant to right now. Hey, Brennan, I just started my first trade publishing job as a publicity assistant. What general advice do you have for making time for your writing as well as the publishing work you're doing for your career?
That's a great question. So I've seen a lot. It's interesting. I've seen people tweeting like, I saw someone tweet recently, and I'm not trying to disparage anyone. I just disagree. Someone said, work 9 to 5, take your hour lunch, and don't read at home. Don't do work at home. You know, your job is your 7 hours a day. Take your lunch break. Don't work on your lunch break. And I'm not, maybe because I'm old. I don't agree with that. Like, I think you can, if you want, there's nothing wrong with working at home if you love what you do. And, you know, it's not about like the company taking advantage of you. Is if you love what you do it when you want to do it. That's just me. In terms of writing while you're working, you know, if you can find a specific amount of time to write every day, I think that's super helpful. If you have, okay, it's 10 o'clock at night, I'm going to pour myself a glass of wine. That's just me. And from 10 to 11, whether I write a page or 2 pages or half a page or 100 words, I'm going to spend an hour. I'm going to shut down all my social media. I'm just going to have a Word document open, not Google Docs. I hate those. Again, old. And I'm just going to write for that hour. It's not, some people, I have a friend, he says he gets up, I can't believe this. He gets up every morning at 4:30 and writes for an hour. And I'm like, dude, I didn't even know there was a 4:30 in the morning. So like everybody works differently, but I think, you know, having a set amount of time where you have, and look, I get it. My brain wants to click on Twitter or Facebook because it's just like, it's almost like a release for me. It's like a tension release, which sounds so pathetic, but I get that. But if you can figure out 1 hour, even if it's 20 minutes, if it's 10 minutes, where you're just like, these are the 10 minutes or the 20 minutes, or you can even maybe start with 10 and then increase every month. It's going to increase by every week. It's going to increase by 10 minutes where you just, even if you sit and look at the screen and only write bullet points, I recommend that. And the one thing that I recommend more than anything is synopses, outlines. Write those before you write anything. Even if you don't know the entire story, even if it changes while you're writing it, writing off a synopsis has been the greatest thing that's ever happened to me. And that's why I've been able to write 2 novels recently in 2 months each. And the one of them that's out is my best reviewed book, which is, it's the Morbius novel that I wrote for Marvel and Titan. I wrote it in 2 months, and it was fully outlined before the 2 months started. Which is why I was able to, the only reason I was able to do it is because I was able to shut my brain off and just sort of, it was sort of like the old novels, like I was telling you about, the sort of the stream of consciousness when I wasn't even thinking. I had the outline and I just had to get from point A to point B, and I allowed myself just to write, and it was actually very freeing. So if you have an outline in 20 minutes or an hour a day where you're just writing based on the outline and not thinking too much about the words, you can come back later and edit. The key is to get that draft, the first draft written. The reason the book that I got published took 15 years is because I kept rewriting the first 50 pages over and over and over and over again for like 10 years. And I think that's what I also recommend is do not get stuck on those first 50 pages. Keep going. Don't even look back almost. Don't reread. Just keep writing. Keep writing. Okay. That's too much answer. Sorry.
Yes, no such thing as too much answer. Thank you. So another question actually just popped up that's also relevant to this. Do you have any advice for freelance comic book editing? I'm just starting out as a comic book writer, and in the future, I'd love to push myself to be an editor for someone else after I've completed a couple more projects. Any book recommendations about editing? I'm a librarian.
Oh, first off, I love librarians. My wife is a librarian. My mother was a part-time librarian. My grandmother was a librarian. Like that's my thing. I love it. I love librarians. Thank you. I I'm like the worst person to ask about book recommendations because like I'm just a mess and I don't really read any anymore. I just sort of do what I do. So I'm so sorry I don't have any good recommendations there. As far as comic book editing goes, the comic book industry is super complex. And I would just recommend writing to comic book companies, having your resume and saying I'm available for work if you have any openings. And also, I do see on Twitter, and I know this is not a great answer, people asking, I'm looking for a comic book editors or anybody out there. And if you have any friends to do, honestly, this is a terrible answer in a way too. I know people want to get paid, but if you have friends who need comic book editing, do a couple for free just to resume build until you have a resume. Reach out to people friends of friends who write comics, and do some editing. And then once you have a bunch under your belt, then you can start to ask to get paid. That's a tough one. The comic book industry is tough. It's a very complicated industry, and I'm happy to get into that a little more, but it's just like making contacts in the comic book world is helpful, and following people. I know Twitter is like, it's like equal parts like amazing and awful. And I realize that it's really awful in a lot of ways, but I have really learned to like it over the last couple of years, just as it got really bad in some ways. But just the amount of education that's available on there from professionals, I would say follow comic book editors, comic book writers, keep an eye out for opportunities, and be editing friends' work, even if it's like terrible. I think it helps. I mean, just like edit anyone who's working on something. I would say edit their stuff, whether it's for a small fee or for a 6-pack or a pizza or whatever.
Love it. So that's a good time to bring up Scout Comics, which you're wearing one of the hats, which is a sharp hat. So tell us about Scout Comics, how you got involved, what the whole inspiration was behind all of this. Just tell us about Scout Comics in general.
Yeah, Scout's a crazy story. So yeah, as you know, as I've said, I've been submitting comic books basically my whole life, to the big two, to Matt Wagner. And so I sold my first comic book in 2005. It came out in 2006 called Scatterbrain. It was published by Marcosia, which is a UK-based company. And then my editor, a great guy named Rich Ems, who's in the UK, he emailed me. I was working for Bob and Harvey Weinstein, and he said, I've been talking to King Features. They own Flash Gordon, and they would be open to hearing a pitch. Do you want to pitch Flash Gordon? Now, asking me if I want to pitch Flash Gordon, I mean, so I'm 50. So in 1980, I was 8 years old and I saw Flash Gordon in the movie theater, and I love that movie. I was the perfect age to see that movie. So again, you asked me if I want to pitch Flash Gordon. I'm like, hell yeah, I want to pitch Flash Gordon. So I came up with a pitch. I submitted it. I didn't know at the time we were up against Dynamite, who's my arch enemy company. And they picked ours over Dynamite's, apparently. That's allegedly, at the time. And so I was given the opportunity to write Flash Gordon, but we didn't have a publisher. They just loved my take. And so actually I emailed one of the heads of Image, who never responded to me. I won't tell you who that was. And then Rich was like, why don't we just self-publish this? And I was like, oh, okay, I don't know what that means. So we were able I was able to get some funding, and we started a comic book company. It wasn't called Scout. It was called Arden, which is the worst comic book name ever because no one could pronounce it or spell it. It was ARDDEN, just awful. And we published Flash Gordon that I wrote in 2008. And it was really well received. And that began the start of this comic book company. So at first it was great. We did a Casper and Friendly Ghost reboot that did really well. We did an Atlas Comics reboot. That was the old 1970s art. I'm sorry, Atlas. That's sort of a footnote in history, but it was created by Martin Goodman, who also created Marvel Comics and was Stan Lee's uncle. Atlas, they had Howard Chaykin. They had Steve Ditko. They had Bernie Wrightson. They had crazy people. Were in this company came and went in 1 year, in the 70s, and then vanished. And then I rebooted it with the grandson of Martin Goodman, and we came and went. Atlas, the reboot, came and went in 1 year. I guess it's sort of tradition. So then the company, Arden started to sort of fall apart, for lack of a better word. Rich had some stuff going on, and I had wanted to change the company name for a while. And then in 2015, I was just like, we're just doing it. So I, at that point, was doing a lot of this stuff by myself, and I had a small team that I reassembled, and we came up with the name Scout. So it was almost actually a different company name, Bolt, B-O-L-T, but that was actually an Australian comic book company. Like I even bought boltcomics.com or something. But we found this Australian company called Bolt Comics, and our second choice was Scout. And so 2015, the first comic book by Scout was published. We started with Less Than Nothing, literally Less Than Nothing, and that comic was Hench Girl, #1, and that was the very October 2015 was the very first Scout comic. Now I'd been working in Hollywood at the same time, so I ended up selling that comic to Charlize Theron's production company. And news of that got out because I leaked it. And suddenly everyone was talking about this new comic book company, Scout Comics. And so we went very quickly. We had a lot of buzz. And then we started adding staff. And year after year, the company grew and doubled in size every year for 7 years. A key hire was James Hake out of Florida, who's now the president of Scout. He's the sort of the heart of Scout, I would say. And we now have a headquarters in Scout. We've grown immeasurably. It's ridiculous how big Scout has become. I'm the founder and CEO. I would say this to anybody who asked. James Hake is the man. He is, he makes it happen now. But we have got amazing staff. We've got amazing creators. It's all creator owned. I also shop Scout Comics in Hollywood, and it's crazy to see to think back to 2015 when we launched Hench Girl #1 with, again, literally Less Than Nothing, to now. It's pretty insane. In fact, I'm reading right now this book that my friend sent me about Gary Gygax and Ken Arneson, how they started Dungeons and Dragons. And it's just, they started with Less Than Nothing. It's just like, I'm not saying that we're going to become D&D, but anybody who started a small company, it's just, when you see some success, it's pretty surreal. So again, probably more answer than you wanted, but that's the story.
There's, again, never more answer than you give as much answer as you want. So I'm curious then, with Scout, like with how it grew so much, obviously you're seeing pitches, you're seeing new stories you want to take on. What were you looking for? Did you have a specific vision in mind for the kind of project Scout would put out there?
It's a great question. So the #1 thing is it always has to be a great comic book. There was another company that I won't mention that also started the same year as Arden, and they beat us for best new publisher of the year, and they're not around anymore. But anyway, they were so clearly only looking for projects to turn into movies and TV shows. It was very obvious. And so while that is a huge factor in what we pick up, it is by no means the only factor. And so #1, it always has to be a great comic, great art, great story. And #2, a very close #2 is, can we then also help the creator sell this in Hollywood? So those are really the two factors. We generally, it's creator owned. We're not in a position, unfortunately, to pay page rates or advances. We cover printing and distribution that we pay for, and then we split profits with the creators. So look, we're not the perfect home for everybody. Like some people just need to get paid, and I respect that. Most companies that pay a page rate or advance want at least 50% of ownership of the IP. We don't own any of our IP. It's creator owned only. So we're just looking for great comics, and also, can I, as someone who works very close in Hollywood, then go sell those rights on behalf of the creator? So it's been amazing. And we're not really looking to do superhero stuff, primarily because it's such a glut. And look, if we find the next Boys, sure. But every time there's a Boys, it's like, now it gets that much harder to do superhero, because that's another take that's been taken, for lack of a better word. So it's like, if you're gonna do superhero stuff, it's like, and I'm not saying it has to be R-rated or gory or sexual. I'm almost sick of that stuff. The Boys has taken that so far. It's like, is there a new take on this? Otherwise, I want to see horror. Horror is super hot in Hollywood. Is it grounded sci-fi? Is it a thriller? And again, is it a great comic book first and foremost?
So then, as far I'm sure all this stuff is on the Scout website, but for people who are listening, what do you look for in pitches? Like, what should people send to Scout?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't look at only scripts. It's got to be, a writer and an artist, or a writer slash artist. So we're looking for, honestly, if you have a couple pages, I mean, one is sometimes enough, but generally we look for 5 pages of, sequential art that's lettered. Even the lettering is not as important, although it's semi-important. And then a pitch document, a synopsis. If we like it, sometimes we'll ask for the script. Sometimes we just see it, we're like, oh my God, this is it. Like, we just see it and we know it. And it doesn't have to be a natural for a film or a TV show. Like, there have been things where like, this will never become a movie or a TV show, but it's such a beautiful, unique comic book that we're in love. And we have this one thing where if we have like multiple people on our committee to pick, if one person if everybody passes, but one person is insanely passionate, they can throw down their card and we'll buy it. We'll acquire it. Like, but they have to be like, you don't, it's like almost like that golden buzzer on America's Got Talent. But you only get like one once in a while. You can't constantly use your card. So, but otherwise it's a majority vote from the editorial board, with the card, like the golden buzzer. We have the golden buzzer. So I've done that recently, on a title. Every now and then you see something you're passionate about. So yeah, so that again, that's a lot of answer, but that's what we need to see.
And then, are there any like red flags that you'll see in a pitch that's an immediate no, or anything in particular that people can do to set themselves apart? I assume you see a lot of pitches. So what is it that makes the good ones stand out and the bad ones disappear?
I mean, people just send attachments with no message in an email. It's like, I get it, but a good query letter, not doesn't have to be crazy. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I love insert title. Like, usually you can know when it's like you just changing such titles as it's like, it's fine if you haven't read any of the titles, or all of them. It's fine. It's humor. I appreciate self-deprecation, like knowing that, like, we're all just people. We all want the same thing, which is great content. And we all look. I've been submitting. I still submit and get turned down all the time. I still get rejected. I mean, I don't print them out anymore, but like, I get rejected all the time. I'm always coming up with a like crazy idea, like, let's do this character, and is this character available? Like, no, dude, stop. That's another thing, harassing people. It's like, checking in is fine every once in a while, and like super gentle, like, hey, just wanted to see how it's. I just signed somebody recently who just did a gentle check-in, and it had gotten lost in the queue, and because of his gentle check-in, we sent him a contract. Like, I got no problems with a gentle check-in. It's more the angry, like, what's going on? Or like, even like you see this, like the subject line with just 3 question marks. Like, dude, come on. It's not the way. It's like, I think self-deprecation, patience, we're all really busy. And also, like, if you get a pass, like, try again. I don't mind when people say, why did you pass? And sometimes it's just like, honestly, it's the art. It's the art. And then, unfortunately, and if you're just the writer, well, maybe go try a different artist. And again, the artist, let me just, a little asterisk. The artist, in my opinion, as a writer, has the hardest job in comics. So I will just say that, I say bad art, but like, dude, I know how hard being an artist is. I'm the worst artist ever. So like, I have so much respect. My 11-year-old daughter is an amazing artist. Like, all props to artists. I know it's not easy. So when I say bad art, I'm not, I know how hard it is. And anyone who even tries, you're amazing.
So this seems like a good time to segue. We're going to transition into sort of creative process and how you've kept that going throughout the years, how you've developed as a creative throughout the years. So I want to start with this question in the Q&A, which I've been saving. In your career, we can see that you mixed inspiration along with transpiration. Inspiration is necessary for you to come up with basic ideas. Transpiration comes from you keeping the writing pace going. In these days, which of these is more necessary for you?
Transpiration. I never even heard that word before. I feel so dumb. What was the first one? Inspiration and transformation?
Yeah. Is it more important for you to have, or more necessary for you to keep new ideas going, or to
Yeah.
get those ideas through and finish them?
Can I say 50-50? That's a cop out. I think the second part is more important. Because you only need one great idea, right? So like getting like I have started like when I was younger, I started so many novels. It's starting writing is easy.
Mhm.
Like starting is easy, I feel like. And then once you get like whatever far into it, 10% or 10 pages or finishing it. I mean, even I'm writing something now, Bones of the Gods. It's like it starting it was so easy and like finishing it was tough. And so like I think the transpiration, I'm gonna start using that all the time now. That is the more important thing. It's easy. Ideas are almost easy, I feel like. And finishing is hard. Like so like get it done. Like that's what I said. Like I spent 10 years rewriting 50 pages of one novel. And I think if I'd never just finished it, I don't think I'd be where I am now. Finishing that book allowed it to eventually be the first book I ever had published. And so transport, my friend, transport. Wait, is that right? I don't know. Yeah, so finishing, you just need one great idea. Like, although I don't get stuck on it, but like I'm telling you, like having that period in your day, 10 minutes, you can just start with 10 minutes. These 10 minutes, I'm not on social media. I've got my Enya or Yanni in the background, music with no lyrics, whatever it is. And I'm just gonna like write. And again, even if it's 50 words, if it's bullet points, if it's fragments, if it's a page of a novel, if it's a page of a screenplay, a page of a short story. I mean, if you write a page, I always say, if you write a page a day, you've got a novel in a year, you've got a screenplay in 3 months, you've got a short story in a month, like a page a day, a page a day. Even if it's not a good first draft, a page a day.
Mhm. I love that Yanni got a shout out. That's like making
You know
dreams
what?
come true.
I love Yanni. It's embarrassing. And here's a funny Yanni story. Speaking of my librarians, so back in the 80s, I can't believe I'm talking about Yanni. Back in the 80s, CD players were still new. Oh my God. And so you could rent CDs. And there was this cover, if you look up Keys to Imagination by Yanni, I'd never heard of it. He was brand new. I never heard of this guy. The Keys to Imagination was like an egg in the sky with a waterfall coming out of it. I was like, what the hell is this? And I listened to it and I was like, oh, this is awesome, to write to. And so he wasn't cheesy yet. I loved it. And then it got cheesy. I was like, oh, I'm not allowed to like this anymore. But now I'm kind of like, I'm 50. I'm like, I like Yanni, whatever.
I love it. And another question just popped up that's like live audience say you're killing it with these questions, because I was just about to transition into this line of questioning. What's the big difference in writing children's comics and regular/hero comics? And if you want to expand that into sort of writing for different audiences in general.
Yeah, the lanes.
Mhm.
Yeah, people always, kills me. People are like, you have to pick one thing and write it. And look, you know what? There is something to be said about becoming known for one thing. I've got a lot of friends in the horror space. It's all they write is horror, and you become known in a genre. And look, I write horror. I'm not a big name in horror by any means. I'm not even close to a name in horror, even though I'm a horror author. And I've got clients or friends who are like, that's all they do, and you become known for this thing, and you become part of this group. And I just maybe I have done myself a disservice by not doing that. However, if people tell you you can only do one thing, you can only do one lane, I just have never agreed with it. There is something to be said that if you want to be a novelist, that you have to be careful, because sometimes buyers will look at your track record and that can become, if it's too similar in genres. But to get back to the question, if you're a kid inside like I am, writing genre stuff and writing kid stuff is basically the same, because it's about imagination and it's about like transporting. So if you want to write kids stuff, you can write kids stuff. You just have to adjust the language you use, obviously, and to get in the mindset of a kid, and also not to talk down to kids. I think that's some of the worst kid stuff I read is when people think they're writing kid stuff, but they're writing what they think kids think like, and it's just like baby talk. You can write pretty advanced stuff and still be for kids. And I think part of that is reading successful kids literature. So if you want to write middle grade, I've had people pitch middle grade, and I'm like, middle grade is very different than YA, and this reads like YA. So go read a bunch of middle grade that's on the bestseller list or at the top of the Amazon, or go to Barnes and Noble. I mean, as a writer, the best thing you can do is go to Barnes and Noble and look at what's selling and ask, what's selling great in middle grade, and spend an hour in middle grade in Barnes and Noble reading the first chapter of 10 middle grade books. Same for picture books or for YA. You got to know your audience. But there's no reason you can't write horror novels like I do and also picture books like I do. Like, if you want to do it, you can do it. I've been really lucky that I've been able to. I switch lanes constantly, and I don't know how, and I don't have like a pill like how you do it. But I don't think you have to pick one lane. And I think anyone who tells you that, in my experience, is not necessarily correct. But you have to understand what works in them, and that involves research. I was able to sort of organically have that research because I work in the industry, and so I'm getting pitched this stuff, so I'm reading it constantly. But if you're not able to work inside the industry, then you have to sort of figure out a way to be in the industry, which is spending time on Barnes and Noble at Barnes. I really, first off, being in a bookstore is like the best place to be. And so, or a library. I mean, obviously the library is even better in many ways, but spend hours in a library or Barnes and Noble and read. It's like, you don't have to read the whole book. Read the first chapter. Why is this resonating with kids? Why is this resonating with horror fans? Like, the more you know about successful books in your genre, the more you can not replicate the exact thing, but replicate the feel, the cadence, the nuance with your own concept.
Mm-hmm. We have another great question. Y'all are making my job easy today, so thank you for these questions. How does inspiration work for you? Do you prefer to use and work with personal experiences, or just use your imagination? Does music, movies, other books, are they able to inspire you somehow, or do you prefer to avoid other stuff so that you don't sort of double up on what they've already done?
Yeah. I do avoid. I try not to get inspiration from other creative works. I find ideas in the most random places, and it's just from the world. And so I always take things. I'll give you one example. So a couple examples. Here's one example that I love. So when I was working at Macmillan, I was an editor at St. Martin's, and I had to drop off my laundry at the dry cleaners. And so when I was walking to the dry cleaners in New York City on West 22nd Street, one day a week, all the restaurants put all their garbage out. And if anyone who lives in New York City, it's like literally almost a veritable mountain of garbage from the restaurant. It's disgusting. Obviously, it smells awful. And it was summer, and so it was awful. So I was walking past a garbage mountain outside of this restaurant, and on top of this garbage mountain, there was a suitcase filled with clothing and opened, and it clearly, I think, had been stolen and rifled through and then dumped by somebody. The only explanation I can think of. And sitting on top of this suitcase, on top of these clothes, which were women's clothes, was a business card. And so I grabbed the business card, or like a business card case. So I was like, oh, this is so weird. So I grabbed the business card case and I went back to my office, dropped off my dry cleaning, went back to my office, and there was an email of this woman, and I emailed this woman. I'm like, hey, I'm so sorry to email you out of the blue, but I just found this. I think I just found your suitcase. If you want, I can go grab it and I'll hold it for you, and you can come get it. And look, you don't know me, but this is a Macmillan email address. I'm not asking you for anything. So I never got an answer, which is fine. And the garbage mountain was gone the next day, along with the suitcase, I assume. But then I came up with an idea, like, what if the email came back, and et cetera, et cetera. So I came up with a full idea, hired an author to write the book, published that book at Macmillan. It was called No Good Deed. And it was just something I saw on the street that I thought was cool. And it's like, if you can see things, like, sometimes it's a title. I was at the water cooler at Macmillan, and someone said, it's going to be someone who was like one of those Monday mornings. Someone said, oh, it's going to be a Monday. And I said, oh, it's going to be a week of Mondays. And I was like, oh, that's a title. And then I literally came up with an idea based on that title. I wrote a synopsis. I hired a writer. And if you look up, there's a book called A Week of Mondays. It's a young adult novel like Groundhog Day, but a girl who gets dumped, has a horrible day, and then her day repeats. She has a week of Mondays, which is a total movie, by the way. I can't believe it's never been made or options. But I really think, I would say inspiration is everywhere, and just keep your eyes open and extrapolate. take something, a word, a phrase, something you hear, a suitcase on a pile of garbage, and like, what if? What if? It's almost like improv, you know?
That's great. So we're almost out of time. So two last questions. First one, you've given so much good advice here across so many different spectrums, but if we were to just say, you know, one piece of advice to people out there who want to break into comics, what would that one piece of advice be? You can reiterate something you've already said because you've given us so much, but is there one piece of advice that you feel rules them all?
There's a couple, honestly. It's like, I think knowing the market is really important. You know, even if you don't buy every comic, going to the comic book store like I do every Wednesday and just looking what's coming out, talking to your local your LCS owner, and you know, like what's working, what are people excited about. There's a lot of cool indie comics, not just from Scott, a lot of cool stuff going on. Like I'm tight with the head of Boom. I think they're doing a great job. um that's number one. And also, you know, this sounds so ridiculous, just don't give up. Like, I know how crushing rejection is. I've been rejected my whole life. I've been rejected over and over, and I still get rejected often with ideas because I'm always like, I'll email random people. I'm like, oh, you know, with character like Tron. Like I emailed Disney. I'm like, I've got a Tron idea, and they're like, nope. And I was like, okay, that sucks. I did all this work. Oh well. So like, know your market, don't give up, and you know, again, yeah, just keep trying. Like it's just, and don't get stuck on one idea. That's the biggest thing. Keep moving on to the next one. Like you cannot get caught up on one thing.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And then last but certainly not least, what do you have to promote? What's coming up? What do you want people to watch out for? Where can they find you on
Yeah.
social media? All that good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I tried TikTok, but I'm just too old. So Twitter, it's at Brendan Deneen. Facebook, it's my author page, which is at something, I don't know. It's pretty easy. My name is so weird, pretty easy to find. Yeah, I'm back on Instagram because I thought Twitter was going to explode. So that's also at Brendan Deneen, which is impossible to spell, so you have to research my name. The comic book that I have out right now is called The Bones of the Gods, which I think I mentioned. It's a epic fantasy like a Lord of the Rings, about a you know, a teenage girl. It's big epic fantasy, gods, monsters, superpowers, female lead. I have daughters, so I'm all about female empowerment. You know, gotta love my daughters, and I want to give them more female heroes to look up to. I've got Guardians of the Galaxy, my next novel, coming out in April. I just closed the deal to write a novel, an original novel, in one of my absolute favorite movie franchises, which I'm not allowed to announce yet. I can't believe it's actually happening. That announcement will be happening soon. So yeah, again, thank you so much for everybody's time. And you know, look, I get it. Any writers out there, I've been there when you're trying to get your stuff looked at. It's not easy, but it's possible. And again, I would say over and over again to keep trying.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Brendan, thank you so much for taking the time today to be here with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
To all of our listeners, we're going to be, thank you for being here, and we'll be back in 2 weeks, February 15th. So go to negativespace.com/events. That'll be up soon, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.